Hello, and thank you for your question. So your question was, why is it that when the supply of loanable funds increases, that the interest rate falls? So to answer that question, let's remember how the interest rate is determined. So the interest rate is the price, essentially, of transacting loanable funds, and so it is determined in the loanable funds market by the interaction between the demand for loanable funds and the supply of loanable funds. And so here I have represented the loanable funds market with a typical sort of supply and demand diagram that you're familiar with from your 201 days. And so to answer your question, let's start off with an initial equilibrium. So let's suppose that the demand for loanable funds is represented initially by this black downward sloping line, and that the supply of loanable funds is initially represented by this upward sloping black line. And so here, this says that the equilibrium interest rate is going to be 1%, and at that interest rate, $100 million of loanable funds will be transacted. And so that is the market equilibrium. And so now let's imagine that something happens that causes the supply of loanable funds to increase. It doesn't matter for the purposes of this example why. Maybe there is a government policy that increases savings or something like that, but we know that the supply of loanable funds has increased. And let's say that that new supply of loanable funds is represented by this red line here. So what does that mean for the supply of loanable funds to increase? Well, what that means is that at any given interest rate, the amount of loanable funds that savers are willing to supply is now greater. So particularly at an interest rate of, say, 1%, the quantity of loanable funds that will be supplied by savers is now increased from $100 million to $200 million. And so imagine that the interest rate didn't fall. So imagine that the interest rate stayed 1%. Well, we can see that that couldn't be a stable solution, because what would happen is that at an interest rate of 1%, demanders of loanable funds, namely businesses that want to borrow money to make investments, would want to borrow $100 million of loanable funds, whereas at that 1% interest rate, suppliers of loanable funds, namely savers, are wanting to supply $200 million of loanable funds. And so what we have here is a surplus of loanable funds. There is more loanable funds being offered at this interest rate than is being demanded at that interest rate. And so what's going to happen is that, there's going to be essentially, so if you think about this from the bank's perspective, they're going to have money sitting in their vaults that goes unborrowed, because in fact there is going to be a surplus of $100 million, because at that interest rate, businesses only want to borrow $100 million from banks, but savers are depositing $200 million in those institutions. And so they're going to have $100 million just sitting there. The only way, while that money is sitting in the bank isn't making any money on it, right? So the only way that they can get that, the only way that they can incentivize borrowers to borrow more money is to lower the interest rate. And so that's what's going to happen. The interest rate is going to fall until we reach a point where the demand for loanable funds is once again equal to the supply of loanable funds. And just in the way I've drawn this, I just made up some numbers and said, imagine that the interest rate falls to maybe from 1% to 0.75%, and as a result, the quantity of loanable funds that businesses want to borrow has increased from $100 million to $150 million. But because the interest rate has fallen, the quantity of loanable funds that savers want to supply has also fallen, right? Because that's what's represented by this supply curve here, right? That as you lower the interest rate, all other things being equal, suppliers will want to provide less loanable funds. And so by lowering the interest rate, you are incentivizing businesses to borrow more money and savers to save less money by depositing it in banks. And so that's going to happen until the quantity of loanable funds demanded increases to the point to where they are equal to the quantity of loanable funds being supplied. So I hope this answers your question. If not, feel free to email me or stop by during my office hours and we can discuss this more. Thank you very much for your question, and good luck Thursday.